皆様こんにちは。本日は、同志社大学神学部神学研究科およびアメリカ研究科、そして同志社大学一神教学際研究センター主催の講演会、同志社大学名誉学位贈呈記念講演会にお集まりくださいまして誠にありがとうございます。本日の講師はジョンズ・ホプキンス大学教授のフランシス・フクヤマ先生です。タイトルにありますように、先ほど先生に同志社大学から名誉文化学博士の学位を贈呈する式を開催させていただきました。講演に先立ちまして、簡単に先生のご紹介をさせていただきたいというふうに思います。この度先生は来日されましたのは昨日とおととい同志社大学で開催いたしました一神教学際研究センターの国際ワークショップのメインスピーカーとしておいでになったわけでございます。タイトルはイスラームと西洋、副題がアメリカの外交思想を検証するというタイトルで、アメリカからメインスピーカーとしてフランシス・フクヤマ先生、そしてもう一人パレスチナ・イスラエル問題の専門家、それからイランから、イランのイスラム法学の研究者、そして、EU から EU のイスラムの代表の方、4人で2日間にわたりまして非常に充実したまた非常に激しい議論を行うことができました。でこの機会に先生にぜひ同志社大学から名誉文化博士の学位をお送りしたいということで本日その贈呈式を行ったわけでございます。フランシス・フクヤマ先生は皆さんご存知のように現在最も注目されているアメリカの政治学者の一人でございます。先生はアメリカのコーネル大学で西洋古典学を学ばれた後にハーバード大学でソ連外交についての研究で博士号を取得されました。で西洋古典学から外交という形で非常に幅広い学識をお持ちでございますけれども、そのような幅広い学識に裏打ちされた先生の政治思想については高い評価がなされております。しかし何といっても先生を著名にさせたのは先生のこのご出版1992年に出版されました「歴史の終わり」というこのご著書でございます。単行本としての出版は1992年でしたが、その2年前1989年に外交の雑誌であるナショナルインタレスト誌に論文が発表されまして、その後しばらくしてですねソ連が崩壊するということが起こりましたので、この歴史の終わりの中で先生が、予測されました、リベラル民主主義が共産主義というものに勝利するというですね、この歴史の進化について、あるいは、近代化理論についてのご研究が非常に注目され、そしてベストセラーになったわけでございます。で先生は単なる学者ではなく、アメリカ外交政策に対しても積極的に発言を行い、また実際にアメリカの外交政策に影響力を発揮してこられました。1990年以降は特に第一期の現在のブッシュ政権の外交政策に非常に大きな影響を与えましたネオコンサーバティブズ、新保守主義者、日本ではネオコンというふうに呼ばれる場合が多いですけれども、その立場に立つ研究者のお一人として活躍されてまいりましたが、しかし2年前に出版され、そして今年の初めに日本語に翻訳されましたアメリカの終わり、現代は America at the Crossroads, Democracy, Power, and the Neo-Conservative Legacy という、このご著書の中では、ブッシュ政権のイラク戦争を批判し、新保守主義陣営の思想を批判して、今後の世界におけるアメリカの進むべき道というものを示し、新たな新世界秩序の編成を目指す新たな思想を展開されて、おります。それ以外にも、福山先生はバイオエシックスについての研究、あるいは、冷戦後の日米関係についての研究についても、ご著書を出版されております。将来が非常に不透明なこの今日の時代にあって、福山先生は今後世界の進むべき方向性を示すことのできる世界の人物の一人として高く評価されるのではないかというふうに考えております。本日のこれからの予定ですが、この後直ちに21世紀における自由民主主義リベラルデモクラシーの将来というタイトルで先生にご講演をいただきます。通訳は横田陽子さんがしてくださいます。残念ながら、時間の都合上講演の後で質問の時間というものを持つことができません。どうぞ講演をお聞きいただきたいというふうに考えております。それでは、フランシス福山先生をお迎えしたいと思います。
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Professor Mori. I am very honored to have been awarded an honorary degree by Doshisha University and to have the opportunity to give this lecture today on the future of liberal democracy in the 21st century. I have a number of deep family connections with this university. My grandfather, Kawata Shiro, was a professor of economics, formerly the president of Osaka Municipal University, and his daughter, my mother, Kawata Toshiko, was a student here at Doshisha during World War II, and later worked as a secretary for the chancellor at that time, Wasa Hachiro. My father, Yoshio, was ordained as a minister in the United Church of Christ, and then met my mother at the University of Chicago. He later became a professor of religious studies at the Pennsylvania State University, and he spent his first sabbatical, which was also the first time he ever visited Japan, here as a visiting scholar at Doshisha in 1974. My cousin Kawata Teiichi, who is here in the audience today, is also a very distinguished academic and the president of Kansai Daigaku, and his daughter Mari works here at Doshisha, so I have more connections to this institution than I can count. The topic is the future of liberal democracy in the 21st century, which is really a discussion about how political order will develop as we go into the new era after the end of the Cold War, after September 11th, and all of the events that have taken place over the last few years. This is really the same topic as the one that I addressed in my 1991 book, The End of History and the Last Man. What I'm going to do this afternoon is to present an argument for why there is a broad historical process which, as it unfolds, will lead much of the world towards liberal democracy. And then I will talk about four important obstacles or problems that have emerged that will prevent possibly this future from unfolding. And those four have to do with the rise of political Islam. Secondly, the lack of democracy at an international level. Third, the problem of poverty and political development. And finally, the question of technology. The concept of the end of history comes from the philosophers Hegel and Marx, and was understood by many Marxists as the unfolding of a historical process that would lead human societies through a series of stages of development, but that the end of that process would be some form of communist utopia. And that was the Marxist end of history. First argued that we had reached the end of history. What I was saying was that there was a coherent modernization process that would eventually lead countries to higher levels of development. But unlike the Marxists, I did not think that the end point of that story would be some form of socialism, but rather what the Marxists called bourgeois liberal democracy. Now, there are many people who deny that there's a process of modernization. They deny that it's a coherent process, and they deny that it is leading to any particular endpoint. But I believe that the fact of modernization is incontrovertible. And I think the simple proof of this is to watch the way that people move and vote with their feet when confronted with the possibility of living in a modernized society. There are many people who express nostalgia for traditional societies, for societies that existed before modernization. But I think that relatively few of them actually choose in their own lives to live in a developing country that represents the pre-modern world. In fact, there are millions of people every year who try to leave developing countries to go to live in Europe, in North America, in Japan, in other developed societies, because they want a higher level of health care, they want more opportunities, they want access to technology and to all of the other things that the modern world provides. This is not to say that something is not lost in the process of modernization, that certain important values do not exist in modern societies that existed in traditional ones. And I will return to that subject because that, in fact, is one of the powerful sources of instability in modern societies. Now, the first general observation I would make about the state of the world today is that modernization is going on at a very rapid pace in very important parts of the world. The two largest countries in the world, China and India, are modernizing at breakneck speed. They are doing what it took England and the United States 100 years to do, they're accomplishing in 20 or 30 years. And so millions, hundreds of millions of people are being drawn into the modern world as we speak. In my view, this process that they are undergoing is very similar to the ones that the early modernizers went through, and leads to certain consistent and coherent changes in family life, rising individualism, greater educational opportunities, expanding forms of identity, and the development of a complex civil society. And all of this is happening as we speak in important parts of the world.
というのはまさに初期の近代化の中にあった人々が経験していたこと。
The big question that's posed by China and to a certain extent Russia is whether this process of economic modernization will bring in its train democracy, liberal democracy as well. And I think we have to admit that we simply don't know at this point, and we will have to wait to see the development of these societies over the coming decades. But I do believe that there are certain reasons why a country like China will ultimately need a form of democracy if it is to be a truly modern society. Let me give you an example of one of the ways in which China really needs democracy. In the past year, there have been any number of scandals involving tainted Chinese products, food products, toys, other kinds of consumer goods, that has led to the recall of Chinese products in the United States, in other parts of Asia, wherever the Chinese export these goods. The Chinese government, to crack down on its safety regulators and to punish people responsible for these product safety issues. But the tragic truth is that Chinese companies have been poisoning Chinese consumers for many years without any degree of accountability for those actions. At the moment, Chinese producers and government officials feel a sense of accountability only upwards to higher levels of the Chinese Communist Party. They don't feel a sense of accountability downwards towards the people that buy their products or live in their villages or otherwise have to deal with the consequences of their decisions. And that lack of downward accountability means that China will ultimately not be able to solve its very great environmental and safety issues in an effective manner. We may value democracy as an end in itself, but it also has a very practical importance. It is only with that kind of downward accountability that societies can solve problems like environmental safety or consumer product safety. And so democracy, I think, is something that is practically necessary for any complex modern society. Now, one of the most important critics of the idea that there is a single modernization process was Harvard professor Samuel Huntington, who actually happened to be one of my teachers and wrote a well-known book called The Clash of Civilizations, in which he argued that the world would not unify through a process of globalization, but would remain divided into several large civilizational units, and that these units increasingly would be the source of global conflict. Huntington argued that culture was ultimately the critical variable that determined the trajectory of a society, and that liberal democracy was a projection of the cultural values of what he called a Western Christian civilization, and would not ultimately come to be the dominant form of politics in other parts of the world besides those influenced by Western Christianity. It was not a universal value for him. And he argued that other cultures, Hindu, Muslim, Confucian, would develop their own forms of politics. The real question is whether there is such a thing as universal values that will lead all societies along a similar path of modernization, regardless of the cultural starting point from which they began. A little bit like modern natural science. Modern natural science was invented at a certain period in history in Europe, but it's not different in Japan or in America or in Africa or in India. Now, I happen to believe that there are universal values, and I believe that there is a process of modernization that leads from technology to economics to politics that does lead societies to converge in a certain sense in their basic institutions. But I do believe that Huntington is right, that in the sphere of culture you will not ultimately have full convergence, that the cultural traditions out of which different peoples in the world come will remain important to them. And in fact, it would be, I think, something of a tragedy if everybody were homogenized into one single global universal culture. Again, let me give you one example of this convergence. Consider the role of women in a modern society. Many cultures put women in a subordinate place in the social hierarchy. They confine women to certain roles having to do with children and the family. In a place like Saudi Arabia, women are not even allowed to drive automobiles. And the question is, as a society modernizes, will the role of women remain the one that is dictated by the dominant culture, or is there something in the modernization process itself that dictates the entry of women into the economy and greater opportunities for women in the workplace? In my view, the logic of modernization dictates that women play a much broader social role than in traditional societies. Any society that demands that women stay at home and raise families is depriving itself of 50% of its labor force that could be employed productively. And furthermore, the problem becomes more acute as educational levels rise and there become increasing numbers of jobs that women are as capable or more capable of filling than men. And so, although cultures may dictate certain roles for women, I think there is a very powerful logic that pushes them into a different role with the process of development. Now, let me begin with the first of the major challenges to the hypothesis that this modernization process will lead ultimately to greater democracy around the world. And the first has to do with Islam, the religion Islam, and the effect of Muslim culture on political development in the contemporary Middle East and other Muslim societies. Because there has been, in fact, a de facto Muslim exception to the general pattern of democratization over the past generation. There are examples of relatively successful democracies in Muslim countries, in Turkey and in Indonesia and in other places, but there are relatively few democracies in the Arab core of the Muslim world. And over the past generation, we've seen the rise of a form of radical Islamism that is profoundly anti-liberal in its doctrines and anti-modern in the aspirations that it has for social development. In fact, we just had this conference at Sizmor that was just referred to, in which there was a scholar from Iran, Dr. Vaizi, who argued, I thought very cogently, that there was a deep contradiction between the kind of Islamic democracy that Iran was trying to create and liberal democracy. The problem was not the democracy, but the liberal part, the separation of religion from state institutions, which, in his view, was incompatible with the requirements of Islam as he understood them. So the real question is whether he's right in the sense that there's something basic about Islam, the religion, that prevents the emergence of liberal democracy, or whether this is a temporary condition, or whether Islam can be interpreted in different ways that are compatible with liberal democracy. It's my view that alternative interpretations are possible, and not just possible, but have been made historically, and that there's no essence of the religion that dictates that liberal democracy is not possible in a Muslim society. And I think the proof of that is that you do have liberal democracies in parts of the Muslim world. Most complex cultural systems are subject to multiple interpretations and have been fought over in the course of their historical development. Former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore used to argue that there was a fundamental incompatibility between what he called Asian values and liberal democracy, and yet it seems to me that Asian values have not prevented democracy from arising in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and other East Asian countries. Now, I do think that there is a particular problem in Islamic societies, given the Muslim tradition of unifying religion and the state, which makes the emergence of secular institutions more difficult. And I think that that may be at the heart of a number of the challenges posed by political Islam today. But I also think that it is possible to misinterpret the rise of the radical forms of political Islam and not understand that these are actually, in certain ways, familiar phenomena. The very process of making the transition into a modern society is a very traumatic one for any country that undergoes it. It destroys traditional institutions and traditional values. It leaves people isolated and alienated from their own cultural traditions. And under those circumstances, in the history of Europe and other parts of the world that developed earlier, it often leads to backlash movements in which people cling to a certain manufactured identity because they've lost their old identities, their traditional identities, in the very process of modernization. This loss of traditional identity, I believe, explains the rise of Nazism in Germany in the 1930s. It may also explain the rise of extreme nationalism here in Japan in that same period. And I believe that it is the ultimate explanation for the rise of these extremist doctrines, interpretations of Islam, of the sort that are promulgated by Osama bin Laden in the contemporary Middle East, which is today going through that same dislocating modernization process that Europe and Japan went through 3 generations ago. And in fact, identity politics, I think, is one of the biggest challenges to liberal democracy in the contemporary world. In theory, liberal democracies are supposed to recognize citizens as individuals with individual rights, and yet people want to be recognized as members of groups, as Shiites, as Ukrainians, as citizens of Quebec, as Japanese, as Koreans, without regard to their individual status. And the ability of a modern liberal democracy to accommodate these demands for group recognition is one of the biggest challenges today because it leads to group conflict. This is incidentally not a problem that my own country, the United States, has fully solved, because American politics over the past generation has revolved around claims of group identity from African Americans, from Latinos, from gays, from women, from indigenous people, all of whom want to claim group recognition rather than their individual rights as Americans. And this has led to what's been called the balkanization of American society as it divides up into ever smaller identity groups. This has also been a major problem in Europe, in countries like France and Holland and Britain that have large minorities of Muslim immigrants, or the children, second and third generation children of Muslim immigrants, who bring very different cultural values and have not been integrated well into those societies, and has led not just to acts of violence with the radicalization of certain parts of the Muslim community, but also very serious cultural conflicts when a Muslim community wants to force a girl to marry a husband chosen by the family as opposed to the desire of the girl to marry whomever she wants. And it is this sort of cultural conflict that I think liberal democracies must address in the coming years. Now, let me turn to the second major challenge, which is the question of democracy at an international level. This is a problem, I think, that was brought home to many people by the Iraq War and by the behavior of the United States over the past 6 or 7 years.
2つ目の課題に移ります。それは国際的なレベルにおける。
Today we understand well how to create democratic institutions in in compartments or boxes that we call nation states. What we don't really have a good understanding of is how you get democracy across these national sovereign units. It became a particular issue for many people around the world with the Iraq War because the United States is so much bigger and more powerful than other countries in the international system. The United States today spends as much on its defense budget as virtually the whole rest of the world combined, which is an unprecedented disproportion in military power that has not existed perhaps since the days of the Roman Empire. The United States showed that it could reach out and use its military power to overturn regimes in Afghanistan and Iraq 8,000 miles away with very little effort, and there was very little way for countries on that side of the world to influence American behavior. American presidents feel accountable to American voters, but they have an impact on many other people around the world who don't get to vote for the American president. And this, I think, has set up a great deal of resentment and anti-Americanism in the present-day world. Today we have only very weak institutions of accountability at an international level. The United Nations is clearly the chief global institution, but it has problems both with effectiveness and legitimacy. Its ineffectiveness was demonstrated, I think, in the lead up to the Iraq War, where it was capable neither of endorsing the American invasion nor stopping it. And its legitimacy has been called into question by the fact that many of the states that make up the United Nations are not themselves representative of the views of the populations that they claim to represent. The problem of our under-institutionalization of the international system is made particularly acute by globalization. Globalization means that all sorts of things are now able to travel across national borders far more easily than they were just a couple of decades ago. Information, goods, investment, people, ideas, weapons, all of these things have tended to weaken national sovereignty and to create the need for new international institutions to regulate that flow. A change in an interest rate or the introduction of a new technology in one part of the world can throw workers out of their jobs in another part of the world completely separate from it. And there's no overarching political mechanism by which the people affected by those decisions have a way of holding each other accountable. And so this again points to the need for stronger international institutions of some sort. The only part of the world that is trying to develop institutions at this transnational level that will supersede the nation state is the European Union, which, as a result of the bloody history of the 20th century, has decided that the nation state and national sovereignty is itself the source of conflict and needs in some way to be tamed or restrained or even abolished. And that is the reason for the growth of European Union institutions. This can happen in Europe because there's a common historical and cultural background to the states of the European Union, and also a common interpretation of the history of the 20th century. If you go to East Asia, on the other hand, these kinds of transnational institutions are, at the present moment, completely impossible. Japan, Korea, China, the states of Southeast Asia have a much greater degree of cultural difference among them and very, very different interpretations of their shared history, which make impossible the creation of the kinds of larger international institutions that you see in Europe.
ヨーロッパで
Just point out that, again, my country, the United States, is particularly guilty in this regard. The United States is particularly jealous of its own sovereignty. We have a tradition of not wanting other countries to be able to dictate to us what we can and cannot do, and so we've been one of the countries which could have been exercising leadership in this area, but we have not, particularly over the last decade. Now, I don't really know what the solution to this challenge of international democracy is. I suspect the answer is not going to be a new global institution, some form of world government, because I believe that it's simply impossible to construct such a body. What I think is that we are going to need a whole generation or two of creativity in this area to come up with new forms of cooperation internationally that are flexible, effective, legitimate, that provide international accountability. And what I always tell my students is that it's really the task of your generation to figure out what those are. Now, let me turn to the third major challenge, which is the problem of poverty in developing countries. Over the summer, I was here in Japan, and I flew on an airplane from Tokyo on a direct flight to Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. And in the course of 7 hours, I went from one of the most technologically advanced and richest societies in the world to one of the least developed and poorest.
そこで3番目のニュース
While overall the situation of the world in the past few years has been very positive with regard to economic growth, not everybody is in this fortunate situation of people in India or China or other very rapidly growing societies. There are roughly 1 billion people out of the world's 5.5 billion that live on less than $1 a day and continue to do so, and who have actually lost ground over the past generation, not just relative to rich countries, but in absolute terms. In Papua New Guinea, where I was, per capita income has actually declined in the years since that country received independence from Australia in 1975. The same can be said for many countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have gone backwards in the years since colonialism ended. If you can get economic growth going, as is the case for many countries in East Asia, then political development oftentimes follows in its wake. Once you get up to a level of about $6,000 of per capita income, it becomes much more likely that you can sustain good democratic institutions. The real question is, how do you get that growth started in the first place? In my view, the fundamental question or issue is the existence of institutions and a basic level of good government that does not exist in many developing countries. In fact, I think if you explain why rapid development happened in East Asia and to a much less degree in Latin America and then to a very low degree in Africa, it has very much to do with the quality of government institutions in these different parts of the world. What people in East Asia, in Japan or Korea or China, may not fully appreciate is the fact that these societies were blessed with very strong state institutions from a very early stage in their history. If you go to the Forbidden City in Beijing, next to the hall where the emperor, the Chinese emperor, kept his harem, you have the room where the mandarins were examined in order to enter the imperial bureaucracy in China. And this is a tradition that goes back a couple thousand, 2,000-3,000 years in this part of the world. In Papua New Guinea, by contrast, there was no state before the arrival of the European colonists. Everybody lived in tribes or clans of no more than 50 or 100 people, and their world never extended beyond the rim of the valley in which their tribe lived.
一方、
In Europe and Asia, the process of the development of states was a long, drawn-out affair that took centuries to accomplish, and other good things like economic development and democracy came only later at the end of a very long, centuries-long process. In many developing countries, we are expecting these societies to undergo a similar path of development that took hundreds of years in Europe and Asia, and we're hoping that they will do that in the space of just a few decades. In addition, there is a dark side of our modern globalized world that actually promotes the decay of states that are weak in developing countries. The same globalization that allows trade and investment and good things to cross national boundaries also allows drugs, weapons, blood diamonds, laundered money, criminal gangs, terrorists to move from one jurisdiction to another. This process of political decay has changed the whole nature of international relations. Classical international relations in the 19th and 20th century was a game played by strong centralized states. Japan, Germany, the United States, Britain, France, the former Soviet Union, all of which had highly developed political institutions and could authoritatively enforce laws on their own territory. Today we live in a very different kind of world that is characterized by weak and failing states. And many of the most important problems in international politics are ones that are created not by strong states, but by weak ones. Places like Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq, Lebanon, Pakistan, many states in the Western Pacific that do not have governments that can keep basic order and hence become a haven for drugs, for refugees, and for other bad things. And unless the developed states of the world develop other kinds of instruments, we are going to continue to have problems in dealing with this weak state world. The United States has one primary instrument, its military power, and it discovered to its dismay in Afghanistan and Iraq that instrument does not work very well in this weak state world, which is why the enormous power of the United States has been insufficient to bring about the kinds of political outcomes that are desired by the political leadership in Washington. Let me move on to the fourth major challenge, which is the challenge of technology. Now, as I said at the outset, it is the development of science and technology that is the fundamental driver of the modernization process itself. We have absolutely no guarantee that future technological developments will be benign, that they will have good social effects. Up till now, technology has solved many of the problems that technology itself creates, but there is no guarantee that that will continue to happen into the future. We have several examples of dangerous technologies before us. The first of them are clearly nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. Although they did not proliferate as quickly after 1945 as some feared, the proliferation is happening slowly and steadily year by year. They are getting into the hands of more and more countries. The technologies are old, they're relatively simple, and the mechanisms we have to prevent them from moving around the world are inadequate ultimately to stop that flow. What we've had in effect is a democratization of the ability to do great harm to large numbers of people. Today, you could have a recombinant DNA laboratory that could create a killer virus that could be put into effect with very little cost by very many countries around the world. And this is something that simply was not possible 50 or 100 years ago. Another obvious danger is global warming. the cumulative economic development of the world, particularly as it expands to places like China and India, creates conditions under which the very basis of life may be undermined if some of the more extreme predictions for the effects of global warming turn out to be true. One set of new technologies that has been a particular concern to me are benign biotechnologies designed to cure disease and to make people better, but which also open up enormous possibilities for new forms of social control and social engineering. In the 20th century, communist and fascist regimes tried to accomplish social engineering through labor camps, through agitprop, through a whole variety of very crude tools that were available to them at that time. In the future, we may have available much more sophisticated forms of genetic engineering or drugs, psychoactive drugs that go directly to the biological sources of human behavior and will give some people the opportunity to manipulate and control the behavior of other people. What unites all of these technological challenges is that if there is a solution to them, it will only be achieved through the emergence of a level of international cooperation that we have not seen previously in human history, because all of those technological challenges are inherently transnational in scope. The Kyoto Protocol was negotiated here in Kyoto, but it's already been made obsolete by the emergence of new powers like China and India that require a completely different international framework for dealing with it. So these are the, I think, four main areas that I would point to as being particular challenges for maintaining and developing liberal democracy into the 20th century. There may be other issues I've missed, other ways in which democracy can be undermined or subverted, but I think that many of the current trends in politics point to these as the major sources of instability in the future. Karl Marx had a very mechanistic theory of history by which one stage replaced another, leading inevitably towards a certain end. My view is that there is this process of historical development, but it's not nearly as rigid or mechanical as that of Marx. My view is that although there are these larger forces promoting a certain pattern of modernization and development, it's also critically dependent on individual choices made by leaders, by voters, by publics, by groups in civil society, all of which can shape political outcomes in any given society. So I cannot promise you today that we will succeed in meeting any of these four categories of challenges in the future. What I can say is that in many respects, whether we do or not depends on decisions that we as societies and we internationally will make over the coming years. So again, let me thank Doshisha University for granting me the great honor of this degree and for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon. Thank you very much.
今一度同志社の皆様には名誉抜粋をいただきましたこと、そしてまたお話しさせていただきましたことを感謝申し上げて。
福山先生、本当にどうもありがとうございました。今私たち聞かせていただいたように非常に大きなスケールで、今日の世界を分析し、そしてこの世界が抱えている問題を整理し、そしてより安定し、より安全な世界を作るにはどうすればいいかということについて、非常に大きなスケールでお話をしてくださったと思います。で、4つのですね、障害、 リベラルデモクラシーを実現するための障害についてお話になったわけですが、私は特にその一番初めのこのイスラムの問題について、昨日までのこの一神教学際研究センターの国際ワークショップにおいてどういう議論がなされて、そして、非常に厳しい議論が戦わされたわけですけれども、どういう批判が、福山先生のお考えに対して出されたのかということを紹介したいというふうに思います。で、福山先生はこのリベラルデモクラシー、自由民主主義というもの、これがこの普遍的であるということをやはり最後まで主張なさったと思います。で、それに対してイスラムからの意見、先ほど出ましたこのイランからおいでになったバエジ教授、そして EU からおいでになったラマダン教授は、このデモクラシーは普遍的だと。しかしリベラルデモクラシーっていうのは普遍的じゃないと、こういう主張であったと思います。で、バエジさんからするならば、リベラルデモクラシーのリベラルというこの言葉は一つのこの価値観を伴った言葉であって、それはどういうことかというと、それは反宗教的であると。宗教というものをこれを否定して、いわゆるこのある種の価値観というものを伴ったデモクラシーの一つの型なのではないかという主張であったと思います。で、現実にですね、今この欧米世界と、特にアメリカですけれども、アメリカとそれとイスラム世界というのが非常に厳しい緊張関係にあるというのは事実であって、一体それがどこから出てきているのかということを考えてみますと、それはやはり歴史によって作られてきたというところがかなり大きいのではないかというふうに思うわけです。で、今日のお話の中で、福山先生は繰り返しこのリベラルデモクラシーというのが西洋の歴史の中で中から作られてきたものだというふうにおっしゃいましたけれども、それは具体的に言うと何かというとですね、それは西洋の中で宗教間対立が起こったり、あるいはこの少数者をですね多数者が抑圧したりで、そういうですね、先生はその文化による対立ということをおっしゃいましたけれども、それを乗り越えるために一つのルールを作っていく。で、それは何かというと、国家というものとですね宗教というものを分離していかなければならない。で、国家というものは宗教に対して中立的でなければならないというところからリベラルデモクラシーというものは出てきたということは、近代化の一つのですね結論というのはこれは世俗化であると。すなわち宗教というものと国家というものを分離しなければいけないというですね、こういう立場であり、それが一つのこの法体系になって欧米世界に一つの安定を作り出してきたという一つの歴史の結果があると思うんですね。で、ところがですね、イスラム世界は歴史的に見てどうかというと、いわゆるそういうこの啓蒙の時代といいますか、啓蒙思想というものをくぐり抜けてきてない、いわゆるその近代化というものがなされていない。それは言い悪いじゃなくてですね、結果としてそういう違った二つの世界があるというのは、これはこの事実なんであってですね、この二つの世界がどういうふうに共存していけばいいのかというここだと思うんですね。で、今日やはり、福山先生はこの近代化というものはこの普遍的であると、こういうふうに、おっしゃったと思うんですね。その近代化というのがいわゆる世俗化を伴った近代化というものが普遍的なのか、すなわち宗教を否定した形の近代化というものは普遍的なのか。で、イスラムの世界でいうと、今イスラムの場合には政治と宗教というものが密接に結びついている。で、これがもう少しですね長い時間で考えるならば、そのイスラム世界というものも近代化が起こってですね、その宗教とそれから国家というものを分離するような形になっていくのかどうか、これはですねイエスとも言えるしノーとも言える。 で、福山先生の立場はそれはイエスだと思うんですね。いつかそういう近代化は起こるのだという立場だと思いますけれども、しかしイスラム世界はですね、そういうふうには今は考えていないというのが現実なんではないかというふうに思うんです。それで、ご紹介の時に申し上げたように、福山先生はこのネオコンの立場とですね、自分はたもとを分かったというふうにこの新しい本の中でおっしゃってるわけですけれども、それは3番目の貧困のところでもはっきりとその違いが出てきていたと思います。例えばその貧しい問題国家いくつか挙げられましたけれども、その国家にどう対処するかという時にですね、軍事だけではダメだというですね、こういう主張をなさっているというのは、これはやはりネオコンとはかなり違うところであるし、今日は詳しくお話にならなかったんですけれども、昨日おとといのその国際ワークショップの中ではですね、時間をかけなければいけないと。で、この非常にこの短い即効性のあるもの、ショートタームの形でですね、リベラルデモクラシーを強制的に武力を使ってでも押し付けていくということは成功しないと。これ時間をかけなければいけない。で、そういうやり方について、福山先生はリアリスティック・ウィルソニアニズム、現実主義的ウィルソン主義という言葉をお使いになっておられます。で、その現実的ということの意味なんですけれども、相手の国で何が起こっているかということをですね、丁寧に見ていく、時間をかけて丁寧に見ていく。で、その中でいろんな方法を使ってデモクラシーというものの実現を目指していくというですね、やはりネオコンとはかなり違った、非常に建設的で実効性のある立場というものを我々に示してくださったのではないかと思います。もし先生何か、私のコメントに対してよろしいですか。非常に、スケールの大きいお話を今日は聞くことができました。もう一度我々の心からの感謝の意を込めまして拍手をしたいと思います。
I would just like to express thanks to the translator who has done an excellent job this afternoon. Thank you very much.
通訳をしてくださった方にもお礼を申し上げます。ありがとうございました。